beneath a hard white sun that bleached the Wild West to bone and dust, the rancher Elias Crow stood, motionless at the edge of his spread, while the wind stitched the desert together with whispers of sage and old regrets, and when the woman staggered out of the shimmered heat toward his corral with her shawl slipping from her shoulders, and fear cutting her breath into small, pleading sounds, I took it off. "Please," she cried, meaning the heavy iron badge her husband had forced on her as proof of obedience, the symbol of a lawman who ruled by cruelty rather than law. Elias froze, because the words cracked something long buried in him, the memory of another woman who had begged once and been buried without a marker, and the desert went quiet enough to hear his own heart thud like a mallet on an anvil as he watched the woman collapse, to her knees in the dirt, eyes lifted in terror not of him but of what followed her, the posse dust boiling on the horizon. And in that stretched second, Elias made his move not with a gun but with a decision that would burn his life down to ash if it failed, stepping forward to lift her by the arms and pull her into the shadow of his barn where the smell of hay and old leather wrapped them like a promise, her name tumbling out, between sobs, Mara, and with it a story, of a town strangled by a sheriff who used the law to starve families and sell mercy. Back at a price, a husband who wore a star but kept his soul in a lockbox, and a night when Mara had torn the badge from her chest and fled barefoot into the desert, because she would rather die free than live owned. And Elias listened while the past rose up in him like a storm, because he knew that man had buried his brother after a lawful beating, had learned that silence kept you breathing but killed you just the same. And so when the riders thundered up in the sheriff's voice, cut the air demanding his property returned, Elias stepped out slow and steady with his hands open and his eyes hard as flint, telling the sheriff that nothing owned crossed his land without his say, that he'd give water and shade to any soul. And the sheriff laughed and called him a fool and reached for his gun, and the world snapped tight like a wire, shots cracking, horses screaming, dust blooming. And when it ended, the sheriff lay bleeding in the dirt while his men scattered, not dead, but broken in their certainty. And Elias stood over the fallen star and told him that law was a promise kept for the weak, not a club swung by the strong. And the sheriff spat and swore revenge as he was dragged away by his own, and the desert breathed again. But the price of that breath came due fast, because word spread like fire in cheatgrass that Elias Crow had defied the badge, and neighbors who had kept their heads down came at night with lanterns, and quiet hope asking if he meant to stand. And Elias found himself nodding, because once you stepped onto that road there was no turning back. And Mara stayed because there was nowhere else to go, and because something steadier than fear took root between them in the long days of mending fences, and the longer nights of listening to coyotes sing, their closeness built not on heat but on trust, earned in small acts, like Elias teaching her to ride the old mare that favored kindness over spurs, and Mara teaching him to read again from a dog-eared Bible because he'd sworn off words after they failed his brother, and when winter came early and cruel they broke. Bred with families who had nothing and took in a boy who'd been whipped for stealing flour, and the ranch became a quiet center of gravity that pulled the desperate toward it, which drew the sheriff back with warrants and guns, and a judge bought cheap, and the stand came at dawn when frost silvered the land, and Elias lined men and women behind the low stone wall with rifles, old and new, and a single rule: no one fires unless fired upon, because he would not become what he fought. And when the sheriff rode in sneering, with the law on his side, Elias stepped out again and said the land would not be taken and the people would not be bled. And Mara stood beside him, not hidden now, her spine straight, the badge gone forever. And the first shot rang from the sheriff's side, and the fight erupted like a thunderclap. But it was not chaos. It was a grim order born of restraint and purpose. And when the smoke thinned, the sheriff was captured alive. The judge fled, and the town, trembling, chose a new way with a council instead of a tyrant. And in the months that followed, the rancher who froze once and then moved became something else, a keeper of a promise he'd made to a woman on her knees in the dust. And Mara found her voice in teaching and tending and standing in rooms where men listened because they had seen what happened when they did not. And though the desert never softened and danger never vanished, there were evenings when Elias and Mara sat on the porch watching, the sun sink blood red and gold, knowing that the words that began, it all were not a plea of surrender but a declaration of choice, that taking something off can be the bravest act there is, and that a man who freezes at the right moment can change the course of a life, a land and a law written at last in human terms rather than iron. And so the wind kept stitching the West together with new whispers, carrying a story of a rancher who made his move not to claim a body but to defend a soul, and in doing so found his own.